Welcome back. On 23rd of February 33 BCE, a royal tax exemption decree was granted for Publius Canidius Crassus, a key lieutenant to Mark Antony. Canidius received rights to export roughly 300 metric tons of Egyptian grain annually and import 5,000 amphorae of Italian wine, all tax-free. Concessions that directly supported Antony's military logistics against Octavian, whom he was fighting for control of Rome. The main body is standard Ptolemaic chancellery Greek, penned by professional scribes, but at the bottom appears one word in a distinct, less formal hand. This is the only surviving example of the handwriting of Cleopatra VII, and it simply says, "Ginestoi," do it. With this one word, Cleopatra cut through potentially weeks of the usual administration and delay and ensured that Mark Antony got his grain immediately. Cleopatra was not a romantic or frivolous femme fatale or the plaything of powerful older men. She was a woman in complete control of her country, who paid attention to detail and was loved by her subjects. More than 400 years after her death, Egyptians were still coating her statues with gold. And when she wanted something to happen, it did. The period between the death of Hatshepsut and the accession of Cleopatra VII, we'll just call her Cleopatra from now on, sees this long, uneven evolution in the forms and perceptions of female power in Egypt. Thutmose III's effacement of her images didn't signal a blanket rejection of female authority. Royal women continued to be essential as great royal wives, king's mothers, and bearers of dynastic legitimacy. But the office of king was, after Hatshepsut, treated as emphatically masculine in visual and titulary terms. Her posthumous treatment is a kind of closing of a window. Female kingship had been tried, and now the system restabilised around male succession. But elite women remained visible in court and in religious circles. With Alexander the Great's conquest and the establishment of the Ptolemaic dynasty in the late 4th century BCE, Egypt became part of a wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern system of Hellenistic monarchies. Ptolemaic kings were Macedonian Greeks by origin, but they adopted the title and some functions of Pharaoh in dealings with their Egyptian subjects, while presenting themselves as Hellenistic leaders to the Greek world. Within this dual framework, queenship took on new forms. Ptolemaic queens were co-rulers, and they were integrated into ruler cults as divine or quasi-divine figures. Marriages between brother and sister, shocking to Greek observers but intelligible in Egyptian terms of preserving the royal bloodline, placed queens at the very core of dynastic ideology. These queens were represented both in Greek and Egyptian styles, sometimes with attributes of Greek goddesses like Aphrodite or Demeter, sometimes as Hathor or Isis in temple reliefs. By the 2nd century BCE, female rulership in Egypt was embedded in an explicitly bicultural visual and religious system. Ptolemaic practice made the public political role of queens more routine. While they still rarely ruled entirely alone, the ideological move that Hatshepsut had to defend as an exceptional stretch of tradition, placing a woman at or near the apex of political theology, had become structurally normal. By the time Cleopatra was born in 69 BCE, there was ample precedent for active, high-profile queens. Cleopatra's own dynasty had produced multiple powerful women who co-ruled, intervened in succession, and received cultic honours. But at the same time, the political environment was harsher and more complex than anything Hatshepsut had faced. Where Hatshepsut negotiated her rule within a largely self-contained Egyptian elite, Cleopatra's generation confronted Roman senators and generals whose literary and moral frameworks were often hostile to powerful foreign women. The tools that Ptolemaic queens had, dynastic marriage, eroticized imagery, divine associations, could easily be recast in Roman discourse as signs of decadence and manipulation. So when Cleopatra came to the throne, the conditions for female rulership were paradoxical, internally normalized by centuries of Egyptian and Ptolemaic practice, but externally vulnerable to being delegitimized by the dominant Mediterranean power. Before she came to the throne, Cleopatra grew up inside one of the most politically intense royal households in the ancient Mediterranean. As a Ptolemaic princess, she was raised in a court shaped by Greek dynastic traditions, but ruling over an Egyptian kingdom. So her education probably combined languages, literature, diplomacy, and the practical realities of survival within a family where power was always being contested. Her early life was marked by constant exposure to factionalism, succession struggles, and the need to understand both Egyptian and Greek political cultures. In that sense, she was prepared from childhood not simply to be royal, but to be politically astute. Cleopatra became leader in 51 BCE, when her father, Ptolemy XII, died and left the throne to her and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as joint rulers. The Ptolemaic kingdom was fragile, deep in debt, and entangled with Roman power struggles. At first, she tried to govern in her own right, but the court factions surrounding Ptolemy XIII quickly turned against her, and the struggle for power escalated into open conflict. Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria around 48 BCE and fled into exile in Syria, likely near the Egyptian border, where Ptolemaic influence remained strong. There, she actively gathered support from local Ptolemaic loyalists, Syrian levies, and mercenaries, raising a small army to challenge her brother's faction. She wasn't content to wait around for something to happen, but when something did happen, in the form of Julius Caesar, she was quick to take advantage. She was smuggled back into Alexandria, hidden in a laundry sack or a carpet, to meet Caesar, who had just arrived in the city chasing Pompey, with whom he was fighting for control of Rome. Cleopatra was 21 years old when she met Caesar, who was 52. She quickly secured his backing by appealing directly to her father's Roman will, which explicitly named her as co-ruler, a document Caesar, as a Roman magistrate, had every reason to honour over the boy king's faction. Her bargaining was pure realpolitik. She offered Caesar immediate control of Egypt's treasury to offset Rome's massive loans to her father, plus a guaranteed grain supply vital for his legions and the Roman population. In return, she wanted his legions to crush Ptolemy XIII's forces. Writing 100 years after the event, Plutarch notes that it was Cleopatra's charm and intellect that won Caesar personally, but the deal was more pragmatic than that suggests. Caesar stabilized a key client state without conquest, while Cleopatra gained a throne and 9 months later bore Caesar a son, Caesarion, securing her dynasty with his heir. This wasn't seduction, it was a calculated pact between equals, transforming her from exile to dominant ruler. Less than a year later, Caesar's legions crushed Ptolemy XIII at the Battle of the Nile, eliminating her primary rival without her needing to fight alone. Ptolemy drowned trying to escape, leaving her dominant. The deal she struck also got Egypt out of a financial hole. Ptolemy XII owed Rome about 17.5 million drachmas, or about a quarter of the country's annual budget. Caesar forgave or restructured much of that in exchange for grain and cash, easing Egypt's fiscal strangulation while keeping Cleopatra in control of revenues, and she ran the economy very well. She retained a monopoly on Nile grain, which was 20% of Rome's supply. Not for nothing was Egypt called the breadbasket of Rome, which she used as diplomatic currency for decades. Without Caesar, her exile army might have failed against Ptolemy's forces. With him, she ruled unchallenged until 30 BCE. Proving subservience was a calculated step to consolidate power, and she ruled for an extraordinary 21 years, from 51 BCE to 30 BCE, outlasting nearly all her Ptolemaic predecessors, in a dynasty where reigns averaged just 12 years amid relentless internal strife and external threats. This longevity alone marks her as an exceptionally effective leader, especially given the kingdom she inherited, debt-ridden, factionalized, and teetering on the edge of Roman absorption. While Roman propaganda reduced her to a seductive villainess whose excesses doomed Antony and bankrupt Egypt, the reality is starkly different. A pragmatic, hands-on administrator committed to her kingdom's survival. Her economic policies demonstrate this competence with precision. Cleopatra confronted a treasury crippled by her father's debt to Rome, compounded by low Nile floods and famine risks. She responded decisively, devaluing the silver currency by about 25% to align with the Roman denarius, minting vast quantities of standardized bronze coins to stabilize local trade, and reforming tax collection to boost agricultural exports. Papyrus records from her chancery reveal her direct oversight, including the famous record I mentioned at the start of this episode. All these measures not only generated surpluses, but preserved Egypt's vital grain monopoly. Politically, Cleopatra's resilience shines through repeated crises. Exiled by her brother, she rallied Syrian mercenaries and loyalists before smuggling herself to Caesar, securing his legions to crush her rivals. She navigated Antony's volatile alliance and Octavian's encirclement, commanding her own fleet and fortifying Alexandria. Unlike shorter reigning Ptolemies plagued by coups, she maintained internal stability for 2 decades, with Egyptian subjects showing minimal revolt despite hardships, a testament to her authority. Culturally, she bridged Hellenistic and Egyptian worlds in ways that solidified her legitimacy. The first Ptolemy to speak Egyptian fluently, she reportedly spoke 7 languages in total, Cleopatra positioned herself as a new Isis, lavishly funding temples like the Dendera complex and integrating Ptolemaic ruler cults with pharaonic ideology. This duality, Greek queen to elites, Isis pharaoh to priests, ensured native loyalty. Her cults endured into the 4th century CE, with priests still gilding her statues centuries after Roman vilification. Cleopatra was not infallible. Her heavy reliance on Roman patrons ultimately backfired, but myths have obscured a leader who prioritized stability over ideology, ruling longer and more capably than most Ptolemies. By recasting her as a frivolous femme fatale, Octavian's propaganda exalted his victory while erasing the strategic monarch who kept Egypt independent against the odds. Modern evidence restores her as a formidable leader, economically and culturally astute and politically tenacious, a woman whose real legacy far outshines the diminutive caricature. Cleopatra's reign ended in tragedy and the final annexation of Egypt by Rome in 30 BCE. After a crushing naval defeat against Octavian's forces at Actium, she and Mark Antony retreated to Alexandria, where Octavian's army landed the following summer. Antony, falsely informed of Cleopatra's death, fell on his sword in despair. She survived only days longer, likely taken poison rather than the dramatic asp bite legend popularized by Roman sources. Octavian immediately tried to control the narrative of her death, transforming military conquest into a moral crusade. He paraded her captured treasures and images through Rome in a lavish triumph, commissioning coins depicting Cleopatra as a defeated captive dwarfed by Nike, the goddess of victory, and commissioning poets like Virgil to cast her as a decadent Eastern sorceress who corrupted Antony and threatened Roman virtue. This propaganda erased her as a legitimate pharaoh, recasting her as Regina Meretrix, a whore queen, to justify annexing Egypt as his personal estate while systematically melting down her statues to obliterate her public memory. Caesarion, her 17-year-old son by Julius Caesar and proclaimed co-pharaoh, was lured back from Upper Egypt with false promises of mercy and swiftly executed, his death eliminating any claim to Caesar's legacy. Her three younger children by Antony, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, aged 6, and infant Ptolemy Philadelphus, were paraded in golden chains during Octavian's triumph, but spared execution as too young to threaten. In Egypt, however, Cleopatra's legacy as new Isis proved resilient. Priests continued her cult at temples like Dendera for centuries, despite Christian suppression, a stark contrast to Roman vilification. This local veneration affirmed her as a beneficent ruler who stabilized the economy, bridged Greek-Egyptian cultures, and preserved balance amid famine and debt, outshining most Ptolemies in effectiveness. Ultimately, Cleopatra's 21-year rule, longer than nearly all her predecessors, was successful and her defeat less of a personal failing than the inevitable collision of Ptolemaic Egypt's fragility against the rising Roman Empire. Octavian's narrative dominated Western tradition for centuries, birthing the seductress myth, from Shakespeare's tragic lover to Hollywood's glamorous temptress, that still grips popular culture today. But this caricature fails to capture Egypt's last great pharaoh, the hands-on administrator who stabilized a bankrupt economy, the naval commander who led at Actium, and the multilingual strategist who ruled for 21 years, outlasting nearly all Ptolemies against famine, coups, and Roman encirclement. While Rome melted down her statues, Egyptians gilded them as new Isis 400 years after her death. Her true measure lies in these concrete achievements and her people's enduring veneration, not the diminutive shadow her conquerors cast, a shadow that scholarship has long done away with, even if popular culture still clings to it. Next time we stay in the same part of the world but move forward 300 years to look at the life of Hypatia, a philosopher, mathematician and astronomer who became one of the most prominent intellectual figures in late classical Alexandria. But for now, thank you very much for joining me. Please remember to like, share and subscribe on your way out. It really does make a big difference for a small channel like this. And remember, whatever you're up to, have a great day.